Hey guys, my name is Scoby and welcome back to another video. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at the Gamesir T4 Mini. Let's keep this a nice mini review. Let's jump right into this.
So first I need to mention in full disclosure, this controller was sent to me for free from Gamesir directly to be reviewed. There's been no payment involved, they have not paid for any of my review. This is purely a sample unit for me to test, give you some feedback and tell you if I'd recommend it or not. So just to mention that up front, I did get this for free. This is a sample review unit.
So this is a quite feature-rich controller. It does work for a number of devices, including of course the Nintendo Switch, but also PC and Android devices, which is really cool to see. The first thing we're doing is taking it out of its box. We're going to be looking at some features and connectivity a little bit later. So actually getting into the packaging, it's really simple overall. The first thing we get is of course the controller itself. We get a quick start and information manual, and we also get an included USB-C cable, which is really nice to see. So that gets me onto the first thing of this controller. They didn't cheap out and go for micro USB. This controller charges with USB Type-C, and of course that also leads us to believe that there is an internal battery pack, which are both the case, and it's really nice that they went for Type-C here as well. I'm really happy to see that. So in terms of building material, it is a nice hard black see-through plastic. The see-through isn't too crazy with this black version, although I do believe there's also a white clear version that has much more see-through ability, if that's even a word, and I think this is a really nice design. Overall I think it's quite pleasing. There's only one Gamesir logo here in the middle. Other than that, it's kind of texturized plastic. I think overall it's got a really nice build quality to it. Any sort of twisting and brushing on this doesn't give any creaks or cracking. It feels like it's definitely going to last, and it will definitely survive the little cousin treatment if anyone comes over and tries to play with it in that regard. In terms of shaping, there's nothing too crazy going on here. It is rather a small controller in footprint, especially in comparison to the Switch Pro and the Power 8 controller. I'll throw a visual on screen with the different sizes here. So the footprint is a lot smaller, and I definitely think that's the intended use case of course here with the mini name in the title, but it is quite nice overall. We do have some rivets and indent on the back for some extra ergonomics and grip, which I think do make a big difference, but I think if you do have quite large hands, you will still be able to hold this controller relatively well. I think the overall design and shape is quite nice. Now while we're still on the topic of ergonomics, there is a couple things that I'm not a huge fan of. While gripping the controller is nice, the bumpers and triggers are quite close together, and trying to fit both of your fingers here at the same time is going to be a little bit awkward. So you might want to have to one finger this, which again sounds weird to say out loud, to control both the triggers and the bumpers, so that's something to keep in mind. Otherwise you really are close gripped together like this and it feels a little bit tight. It's not the most comfortable thing in the world I think to do it like that, but overall I think the ergonomics here are relatively good. Now in terms of button and layout, we have most of our normal Nintendo Switch layout here. On the top we have our triggers and bumpers. Right next to this we have our USB-C cable, and we have our synchronization button that we will use of course to connect to our Nintendo Switch a little bit later. On the bottom then we have our typical mode color buttons, along with the button assignment that we will have on our Nintendo Switch once we connect to that a little bit later. And then on the front we have our basic button layout. We have our two analog sticks, our D-pad, our usual face buttons, plus minus, we have home, screenshot, and we have an extra turbo button here that I'll come back to in a little bit later. So in terms of the buttons, they feel pretty good overall. The bumpers have a decent click, they are a little bit spongy, but the big issue here is the triggers are a single button press, similar to the bumpers on the front, so there's no actuation force or there's no real kind of build to anything on this, which is a little bit disappointing, but it does work nonetheless. It's just a single button press, not really any depth to it at all. Now in terms of the analog sticks, I felt like they were okay. I feel like my right analog stick is a little bit tighter than my left in this case. I didn't have any drifting issues or anything like that, but in some controllers you can lift up the analog sticks when there's a little bit of free space here, and in this case I can do it with my right analog stick, but for some reason my left analog stick cannot do it. I feel like it's just a little bit pushed back in the material here. This could be an issue with my specific unit, but that is something to keep in mind, that the right analog stick is a little bit tighter. When you're actually playing around with it, you can feel it, but when you're in game and actually focusing on what you're doing, it didn't actually come out to me too much. I didn't notice it that much. So it is just something I can feel when I'm playing around with it here, but it's just something I thought would be worth mentioning. The rest of the face buttons feel okay. The buttons overall feel quite nice. They're a little bit spongy towards the end, but I think overall they give a nice bounce back and they feel pretty good overall, and they wouldn't really bother me in that regard. One extra thing to keep in mind with the buttons is the way they are placed and the way they are written. The actual letter for the button is recessed inside the controller, and then we have the see-through plastic here, which I guess is mainly to allow light through, which isn't really a problem, but this means if you're looking at the controller off axis in any way, The buttons will not be clear, so if you don't know that A and B or X and Y buttons are where they are on your Nintendo Switch controller, this can be a little bit confusing and you have to look at the controller dead on to be able to get it. And even looking at it dead on, it does warp a little bit, so if you're not familiar with the button layout, this can be a little bit annoying at first until you learn it. For me, this wasn't an issue, but again, just something to worth mention. If this is going to be your first controller, if it's your first experience playing games, that can be a little bit annoying in the beginning until you actually get to learn all the button layout. And one extra nice thing it does have is also the gyroscope built in. So that means if you're playing games like Mario Kart or any other racing games, you can twist and turn the controller to actually control what's happening on screen, which again is another nice feature of this controller. Now in terms of connectivity, I did mention at the start of the video, this is a Nintendo Switch controller, so it connects really easily to our Switch. We simply need to go to pair a new controller on our Switch. We press the search button and within a couple of seconds it connected, no problem whatsoever. One of the nice bonuses of this controller is it does act similar to Nintendo Switch Pro controller, where I can actually turn our Nintendo Switch on, which I really like to see. I feel like this makes this much more compelling. So when your Nintendo Switch is off, you can simply press the power button on the controller or the home button and it will turn on our Nintendo Switch. To turn off your controller, even without turning off your Switch, you can hold the home button for a couple of seconds and it will turn off. And I believe there is some auto shutdown in here to help save the battery, which is a really nice thing. Now connecting it to your Android device is over Bluetooth, which is really nice to see, and it will change the lighting on the bottom to a couple different things, so we can really easily choose the mode that we want to connect to and what device we want to connect to. Sadly, when connecting to PC, our only option is via the USB-C cable, which is better than nothing, so it's not too bad of a thing, but it's a little bit annoying you can't connect it wirelessly, although I wouldn't really recommend Bluetooth. However, if you're on the go, it can be nice to have a wireless controller, but it is still nice to have the option to connect this both to Android, to PC, and to your Nintendo Switch. Now, while we're on that topic of on the go, how about we talk a little bit about the battery life? So for me, I haven't tested this super extensively, but I estimate you'll easily get 6 to 10 hours out of this controller, depending on the battery and depending on the vibration level. So that's a nice result, and I'm quite happy to see that. In terms of charging time, I haven't tested anything. It is charging over Type-C, so I'd estimate it would charge fully within an hour, 2 hours max. And you can play while charging, that didn't give me any issues, but these are just a couple things to keep in mind. I think overall the battery is quite nice here. Now in terms of features, there is quite a few things going on here. As mentioned, it is a black see-through plastic, so that's of course going to give us the impression that there is LEDs on this, and that there is. We do have quite a number of LEDs when you first on the controller. It's quite shocking to see. It's actually quite nice, and we do have a lot of different LED modes and colors that we can switch between with this controller. So to change our LED mode, we press the T or the turbo button. To change the color, we press in the T button and we press in our left analog stick, which will go through a couple of predefined color modes, which is really nice to see. We have a lot of different color options here, so you can really set this up how you want. But we can get some more advanced color modes by pressing in the T button or the turbo button and then double clicking our analog stick. And here we can change to a couple of different breathing modes or rainbow mode and a bunch of other things on this controller. So overall, we do have some nice extra lighting features, which is nice to see. Now, of course, this turbo button does have a couple more advanced options. Some of these I feel like I would never use, but I will mention because I do think they are nice extra options. So there's a couple different things we can do with this turbo button. The very first thing is we can change the vibration intensity. To do this, we press and hold the turbo button and we use the D-pad up and down to turn up and down the intensity of the vibration, and it will give a small vibration to give an example of the feedback. There's about 4 vibration steps here from off to very strong, and the vibration motors on this do get very strong, so it's really nice to see that you have this option directly in the controller. They can really easily enable and disable the vibration. The next thing we can do is set up a turbo or automatic press function. So how this works is, for example, if we press our X button and we press and hold the turbo button, it will automatically spit out a bunch of X's onto our screen really fast. I will show this as best I can with the example on screen, and you can see just like that it will spit out a bunch of buttons. However, we can also press and hold the turbo button and the button we want, and it will automatically keep pressing this button until we click our turbo button again to stop, and then this is now programmed into our turbo button, so whenever we press it again it will automatically do this action again, which is really cool to see. To clear all the previous turbo commands, we can press and hold our turbo button for a couple of seconds. Our controller will vibrate, and that means we have disabled and remapped our turbo button to be back to its default state so it can completely turn off. These are cool features, but for me, I really don't know when I would ever use something like this, but depending on the games you're playing, maybe this would be useful. This is another nice thing to keep in mind with this controller. So now the next and probably one of the most important things to think about when you're getting a controller like this is pricing and recommendations. So this controller comes in somewhere between 30 and 40 euro depending on where you're buying it and when you're buying it. Right at the moment, looking at the Gamesir website, it's around $35. So depending on where you're shipping it from and things like that, the price can vary, but around 35 euro is what I'm going to be using as the pricing for this controller. This is where I feel like it gets a little bit tricky to recommend or not recommend it, because there's quite a lot of controllers on the market for this price, especially for the Nintendo Switch, with a varying number of different features. One of the big ones to come into mind right now is the Power A controller for the Nintendo Switch. Of course, this does have some limiting features. It doesn't have any of the LEDs, it doesn't have any of the turbo buttons. It can't necessarily connect to other devices depending on the controller you get, but there are some advantages to a controller like the Power A. One is it has a full-size layout, so in terms of ergonomics and grip, it is a lot more comfortable, and depending on the version you get, you actually get some extra Pro buttons on the back that can be remapped to extra face buttons, which I also think are much more useful than a turbo button, depending again on the games that you play. But that is something to keep in mind as well, that there is quite some competition on the market. A couple of advantages of this, as recommended, is the LEDs on it. We have a built-in battery pack versus an external battery here, where you actually have to enter AA's into the controller, which I think is a big downfall of something like this in comparison to the Gamesir T4 Mini. And of course, if you're going to be bringing it around a lot, this is going to be a much more robust controller. Holding these next to each other, I actually feel like the T4 has a bit of a better build quality in comparison to something like the Power A. Just in terms of the grip and feel, I feel like when I'm twisting, I can hear creaking and cracking on this, whereas with the Gamesir T4, I don't hear anything. Now, of course, over time, this might end up going to the same kind of destination as this, but it's hard to tell because I've only had this a couple of weeks. So it depends really long term how it stands up. But honestly, I have a really good feeling about this being able to stand up long term, but it really depends on what you're trying to do. If you're going to be playing a lot at home, I think getting something like a Power A is a better choice. Or if you're on the go and you like to use a lot of different devices, I think getting something like a Gamesir T4 Mini might be the best choice. Although if money is not as much of a concern for you, you then have to step up, of course, to Nintendo Switch Pro controller, and that's where I think this one really starts to shine out. The battery life is a lot better, the build quality is a lot nicer, and overall it feels a lot better when compared to the Gamesir T4 Mini. We have the same connectivity to Android, we have the same connectivity to PC, but we have a couple of extra things to keep in mind here as well. Of course, this is a lot more expensive, and this comes in at a much lower price point, and we still have the sweet LEDs on here. But overall, in terms of the conclusion, I think I would recommend the T4 Mini in certain circumstances. If you're going to be traveling, I think this is going to be a great pickup. Or if you're going to be giving this to a child who likes LEDs, or you're going to be giving it as a second controller that's just easy to put away, I think this is definitely a nice option, and I would definitely recommend it in this regard. If this is going to be your main gaming Nintendo Switch experience and you'll not have any other controllers, I think it might be worth going for something like a Power A, or if you can extend the budget to get something like a real Nintendo Switch Pro controller, this is where you get 60 hours battery life, you get much more connectivity, and it's overall a nicer controller in my opinion. Of course, it does cost a lot more, so you're actually paying and putting your money where your mouth is. So I definitely recommend the Gamesir T4 Mini, depending on your conditions and depending on what you need. I think it's a nice little controller with a lot of features, and I think Gamesir did a really nice job here. Anyway guys, that's been my review and unboxing of the Gamesir T4 Mini. I want to take this moment to give a huge shout out to the channel members, Sean Daly and Joshua Davis. Thank you so much for supporting the channel, it really helps me out. If you'd like to support me for future videos or have your name shouted out, be sure to click the join button underneath any video on the channel, it would really help me out, I'd greatly appreciate it. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching. If you did, be sure to drop a like. Subscribe if you're new, check out the other videos on the channel. If you want to support me, dropping a super thanks in this video would really help me out, I'd really appreciate it. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, as always, keep it saucy. Peace.